So to begin with, the equipment you'll need is embroidery thread, some felt to sew onto, a needle and a needle threader if you have one. These just make your lives a lot easier when it comes to threading your needle. You'll notice that the wire at the end of the needle threader has a big hole that enables you to put the thread through much more easily than the eye of the needle. So the idea is that you thread that little wire through the eye of the needle, then the thread through the needle threader, and then gently ease the thread back through the eye of the needle. If you pull it too harsh, then the needle threader will break, so you have to do that quite gently. You then want to pull the thread down about halfway through the length of your thread. You don't want to tie a knot onto the needle because it creates bigger knots into your fabric. So I'm going to demonstrate here a process called anchoring on. So you're going to go to the back of your fabric. So imagine the pink side is the front of my fabric, the purple is the back, and I'm sewing through just a couple of threads of the fabric, and then I go back on myself and just put a second stitch in like this. And that's how you attach your thread to your fabric to begin with. This is instead of knotting your thread up over and over in the same place. So this process is called anchoring on. It's much more easy once you get the hang of it for starting your sewing project. And then you can sew through to the front of your fabric. Now this first stitch is called the run-in stitch, and it's probably the most simple to start with. So you're literally going through the fabric, up and down through the fabric with the needle, not going around the fabric, you're going through it each time, and you're leaving a stitch length in between each stitch. So the idea is that you want them to be as neat as possible. You want to try and keep them the same length, ideally, and the same gap in between. So your running stitch can vary in length. It can be wide like I started, or closer together, depending on the effect you're trying to achieve. And then when you're finished, you will want to anchor off. So it's the same process again. Go to the back of your fabric and then stitch through a couple of the threads of fabric, and then back on yourself, and then you can trim it off. So that's, instead of knotting off, you can anchor off. This next stitch is called the back stitch, and it starts exactly the same way as the running stitch. So anchor onto your fabric in the same way, and then you start as if you were doing the running stitch. So you're coming up through the fabric and then back down for one stitch. You leave a gap, come back up through the fabric, and this time, instead of going forward a stitch, you're going to go backwards a stitch. So you're going back in on yourself and filling in that gap. And you continue doing this, so you should have a continual line. So back up one stitch in front and then back on yourself. It's almost like you're drawing a line with the thread. Blanket stitches are our next stitch, which is a great one for sewing two pieces of fabric together. It's a nice decorative stitch as well. So imagine I've got two pieces of fabric like I'm showing you here with the pink and the purple. So you're going to start off in a similar way as to the running stitch and the back stitch. You're coming up to the top of your fabric. And this time we are sewing around the edge of the fabric, not through it each time. So with the running and back stitch, you had to go up and down through the fabric. Now we're all going around the edge of the fabric. So one stitch looped round like this. And then you put the needle through the loop you've created. So you don't want to pull it tight on that first stitch. You need to leave it loose enough that you can get the needle back through it. And then you just repeat this process. So going through both pieces of fabric through to the front again. pull the thread but leave a little bit so you've got a loop, and then put the needle through the loop before you tighten it. Once again through both pieces of fabric, through to the top, pull the thread, leave a loop, and put the needle through the loop. And what this stitch does, as well as looking very pretty, it enables you to sew two pieces of fabric together, but it's also good if you're trying to create something with some stuffing or filling. That stitch will hold it in place. This next stitch is called a couching stitch. It's sometimes referred to as a threaded running stitch. So you start off by completing a running stitch. So you could go back to your sample here from the first running stitch I did. And then you want a different coloured thread for this to be highly effective. So same again, anchor on from the back, come through to the front, and you're literally going to be weaving the thread between the running stitches. So you're not actually going up and down through the fabric. You're going underneath the stitch from one direction, and then underneath the stitch from the other direction. It's a nice way to add another colour into your stitch work. This next stitch, the chain stitch, is a little bit more challenging. So once again, you start in the same way, anchor off from the back, thread through to the front of your fabric. And this time you're going to create a tiny little stitch directly next to your first one. So instead of going forward, you're going left or right to that stitch. Pull the thread through, but leave a loop. And that loop is the chain link in your stitch. So you want to try and keep that the same length each time. So this time I'm coming back through the fabric, one stitch in front and through the loop. And then down next to it on the other side of the thread. Again, leaving a loop, trying to make sure that it's the same length as the first one. So that's my next chain link. Up through the chain link, and then back down next to it. So this one is a little bit more tricky to get right, but once you get into the flow with it, it's a really nice decorative stitch. It's a little bit more interesting than the running stitch. Granted, it is a little bit trickier, so it might take some practice, especially on getting the chain links the same length. What can also be tricky is keeping the stitches in line, so you might want to consider drawing a line in pencil on your fabric, especially if you're doing some sample pieces and just practicing first of all, and that will give you a guideline to follow. Finally, we've got a cross stitch. And clues in the name of this one, you are effectively drawing a cross with your stitch each time you stitch. So you're just coming up through the fabric, and this time imagine there's some imaginary guidelines there. You're going up diagonally across on yourself, back down underneath, and then diagonally across on yourself again. Again, if it helps you, if you're struggling a little to begin with, you could try drawing with pencil the crosses to follow. tip with this one for creating a continual line is making sure that your starting point on your next cross is at the end point of your previous cross, so that you don't have any gaps in between and it's a long continuous line of cross stitch. So now it's your turn to have a go. Don't be afraid to experiment and have fun with it. It might not go right first time every time, but the more you practice, the stronger your stitches will become.